Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. As you know, in intellectual circles, there's no such thing as a free lunch, so you now have to have some fairly meaty content. The Canberrans here will, of course, remember that if we'd been here a while back, we would have had a magnificent view of the power station over there. But we can now see that Canberra has, of course, adequately answered Australia's housing crisis with those modest apartments. I'm Peter Spearritt, and I'm welcoming you to this event as the chair of the Academy's Public Forums and Communications Committee. In embracing the Academy's interest in public policy, I invite you, when using the conveniences later, to notice that on the far wall we have black and white portraits of all Prime Ministers from Hawke to Turnbull, and they're all looking remarkably grim, so do notice that. Social scientists, as you know, come in all shapes and sizes, and I'm sure that almost everyone here today has studied some economics, history, psychology, geography, or one of the many other disciplines represented in the Academy. So on that note, how many people here today filled out the recent census online? Put your hand up if you filled it out online. So that's about 50%, along with the current Prime Minister. And how many antediluvians continue to stick with print? Hands up proudly. Goodness me, how interesting. Oh, right, now, yes, how many followers of Bernard Keane didn't fill it out at all? Our President, Glenn Withers, comes out of an evidence-based public policy tradition, which is one of the things that the panel will be shortly discussing, where we continue to try and write for the general public, as well, of course, as more specialist discourses. And obviously an academy like this does embrace the census, despite a spot of bother with the submissions. Glenn Withers has had a distinguished career in economics, economic history and public policy. He'll be known to many of you, and he's readily engaged in public debates over the last 30 or 40 years. He's also, as some of you will know, he was the founding CEO of Universities Australia. And I put it to you that anybody who can cope with dealing with more than 30 Vice-Chancellors can only be described as a survivor. So I introduce Glenn Withers, President of the Academy of Social Sciences.
Right, colleagues, thank you so much for joining us today for the occasion of launching our report on social sciences shaping the nation. As Peter's indicated, I'm Glenn Withers, the current president of the Academy, and also we've got at the table the former president, Sir Richardson, as well as my eminent colleagues, Bruce Chapman and Linda Botterill, and I'll introduce them shortly after I've done the honours of launching the report itself for their separate and independent comments on some of these matters we're looking at today. I've always loved a statement by a guy called F.M. Cornford. He was Plato's translator, but amongst other things he wrote a book called Academica Cosmographica, which was an attempt to codify the foibles of academics. It was the commandments or rules of surviving Cambridge, basically. And one of his commandments that he came up with was that vulgar fame shall not enter the halls of academe. He believed in a university where you stayed inside the ivory tower. There's much to that view. I was delighted after Universities Australia and 39 Vice-Chancellors and 39 Chancellors, and multiply that up to Deputy Vice-Chancellors and Deans and so on, after mingling with the managerial class of the modern university system, to come back to ANU and go into the Coombs building and have my office just down from the philosophy department, where people sort of wandered the corridors with wild hair and wild eyes and, lycra shorts on, and, hadn't bothered to take off their bike straps and things, but contemplating the nature of, underlying truth and knowledge. It was just a delight to be immersed in reflective academic discourse again. And if you say, hello, walking down the corridor, someone would interrogate you as to the meaning of hello and why you said it, and was this intrinsic to human nature, and when did it first develop, and it was just wonderful to be there. But so there's much to reflection without distraction and what it does by way of provision of rare insights. And many here will also be familiar with Sheldon Cooper in the Big Bang Theory program and his attitude towards applied folk such as the engineer Howard Wolowitz. But as it happens, I reckon Big Bang Theory is easy. Sheldon should try social science. The real world, especially that of people, is really complicated, even for folk who love randomised control trials in social science, such as our local member, Professor Dr. Andrew Lee, who occasionally has to admit the limitations of such knowledge when he's caught out. Moreover, really as regards the purist class, as Freud put it, scholars are people who forsake power, gold and glory for the pursuit of truth, whereby they may acquire power, gold and glory. Again, I cite the case of my friend Dr. Lee as having managed to achieve the Freudian circle. But the Academy is at one with Dr. Lee and Freud, this Academy, at least in what I call the constructive sense. You can have impact and it can derive from excellence. Indeed, it can even drive excellence. They're actually symbiotic. They go together, they work together. The core of abstract, pure reflection and theorisation is the source of a lot of inspiration for insightful, applied and impact and engagement work. And that in turn, in a sense, protects the core, it feeds on it, it protects it, and they interact. In some cases, I know well the case of my friend Bruce, who had to come up with some ideas in a political context for immediate practical policy use, but has spent some time afterwards reflecting on the underlying meaning of it all in a much more abstract sense. Or in my case, for instance, I spent a semester sitting at the front row of lecture theatres, because front rows are always empty, you can get a seat, for John Rawls' lectures on philosophy. And he was as abstract as you can get. He hated applied applications, at least in the course I went along to. And then I spent the summer writing a book feverishly reflecting on Rawls as to how it applied to problems like conscription, because I saw that this was a justice issue. And I wanted to write practically what it meant about why we were rioting in the streets and protesting the commitment to Vietnam and conscription. So I think that symbiosis is crucial and very important. This volume, I think, reflects that very, very well. The Academy determined that it might be useful to show this for the social sciences in Australia by compiling the case studies that form the bulk of the content of the volume we're launching today. To my mind, they're an impressive collection. If you add them up and begin to try and say what it reflects quite apart from the individual detailing down, it puts social scientists, I think, as rather foundational for the Australian way of life. If you look at, say, the development of Medibank, the funding of higher education, the support of children through parental care, health, education and welfare. If you look at setting monetary policy, developing compulsory superannuation or managing water, economy, society and environment, and what of native title, equal pay and urban development, law, justice and the Australian way. Not to mention immigration, APEC, trade policy, our links to the world, or our contributions to the world from plain packaging of cigarettes through the building of economic models for Asian nations to agricultural export management. Yes, ministers, we can punch above our weight, perhaps even in climate policy too, if we really tried. Do we ever hear in sport we can't be a global champion because we're only 1% of the world's population? It's the same in ideas. We actually have the highest share of, I'm falling back to Universities Australia, sorry. We actually have the highest share of our universities of any country in the world's top 100. And that is a genuine and important achievement. The need, I think, though, from this is to show the need for research and analysis. And that's what we're going to hear from our panel They can happily talk about these contributions and others too, and how this might be enhanced further, and respond to questions you may have of them and their experience. But to me, the evidence from this volume is in already. Social science can mightily improve the very fundamental features of this nation and help make it the nation it is, they did, and help solve the problems that continue to be devilish, which are many. For example, what we could do to improve this is also clear though, which is, for instance, we're currently only funding about 20% of national competitive grant applications. And they've already filtered themselves out when they're not really up to scratch. There's just so many that don't get funded. We refuse to release funds for infrastructure in education and research from an endowed education investment fund that's just been closed and kept quiet. We don't move to accept innovative and low-cost ideas that can help with fiscal stabilisation and budget restoration, such as that have been laid before the government from academies, such as income contingent loans for university and industry research and development partnership. Instead of grants, spread the money more widely, and those that succeed pay back, and those that didn't succeed on a speculative basis, then under good management through complex university management systems, have nevertheless contributed to knowledge in numerous ways, and those that win pay to cover those that don't. Or something as simple as forming a national social data archive that can be accessed by researchers openly, transparently and easily around Australia to examine our social capabilities and achievements. This is seriously bad policy when we're not doing that. We can raise capital at about 5% or less, and you get rates of return, as has been demonstrated by research in these areas, of 15 to 50%, and you don't do that, you are shortchanging all Australians. And that's what's happening in our area of concern, as this volume shows. You've got these little bubbles of monetisation and quantification throughout the report, and some of our purist colleagues will find that a little vulgar. But I'm afraid here we are in Canberra, and public servants don't have much time to read text, and they don't have much faith in anything that doesn't have a number attached. And we decided to concede to that reality and try and flag a number of achievements, and we still have the task of adding that up to show what it is overall. But take any small number of them, such as the savings to the government budget from HECS, or the savings to the government budget compared to, say, the United States from having a Medibank type health system, as well as, put aside the savings, the outcomes for Australian health that are so superior to a country such as the United States, which spends twice as much. So this achievement and the potential for more turns out to be especially pertinent in this post-truth, alternative fact, fake news era. As Michael Gove put it recently, challengingly for the UK, I think this country has had enough of experts. Well, universities have been around for centuries, fortunately. One of humankind's enduring institutional creations, reflecting that even longer human thirst for the pursuit of knowledge. This does mean that logic and evidence are what that matters, but not matters for everything in every waking hour. It doesn't mean we crowd out or not rely upon intuition, experience and impulse, but we try and govern it and control it through systematic logic, evidence and clear statements of values. If you rely solely upon intuition and impulse, well, you see what's happening in the United States. And even there, Donald Trump's successful campaign was based on the social science insights provided for him by Cambridge Analytica. So social science is a force for good and for evil. We have to be careful as to how we use it. But it can increase the availability of transparent, systematic knowledge for such decisions, and this will underpin progress, as the volume shows, despite the missteps and frailties of the human involvement in the process. As the chief scientist put it recently, a healthy scepticism is a good thing. His emphasis on the word, Senator Roberts, was healthy. Healthy scepticism. Fortunately, the marketplace of ideas helps mightily with that. We do good and we can do better. There's a whole range of solutions, I think, for the do better that we might wish to save for another occasion, but they involve a list of my 10 commandments to match those of F.M. Cornford. I think we need to adopt a set of commandments of sticking to our last, keep going what we're doing, if, as the British would put it, keep calm and carry on. Keep doing your good social science research. It pays off. Often we're frustrated. We economists always use the example in our mind of all the work on tariffs for 15, 20, 30 years from people like Max Corden and others. Then finally there was the switch point, and that has helped improve Australia's economic standing mightily. Not to say there aren't problems, but helped overall improve Australia's economic position fantastically. And you get a switch point where the accumulated knowledge, evidence and wisdom can have its day. You have to maintain eternal vigilance to protect yourself in the process and keep improving where faults emerge so that you make sure you keep policy up to date and pertinent. Something like the immigration points system I think of as something I've been involved in, and how to use a Bruce Chapman analogy, how gets a bit like an adolescent in need of a good wash. The things accumulate and accrete, and you need to take it and shower it and get it back to its basics. Or you've got to get the incentives right. For instance, in universities, if you don't build an engagement and impact into the metrics by which promotion takes place and even peer rewards are accorded, you're not going to get as readily engaged and impactful as you would otherwise. You've got to work with partners, not just be only in the ivory tower. Certainly a protective belt of engagement is needed for those who do pure work, if I could put it that way. You've got to work with other educational institutions. You've got to work with academies, I think, and academies need to work with each other to produce those interdisciplinary insights that so often in the public sector are wanted from universities. Not just disciplinary depth specialisation, you need both. Your interdisciplinary insights have to be well founded upon good research in depth, but then how it comes together properly. You need to work with funding authorities, with the media, and things like The Conversation are a wonderful vehicle in the state of the modern media to enable that to happen better. You've got to fight back when dangers threaten rather than take it on the chin. Even the March for Science, for instance, back on the 22nd of April was wonderful to see. And I can recall when threats to cut science funding were on offer a few years back, and the Nobel Prize-winning scientists and leading scientists of Australia, the Gus Nossalls and Fiona Stanleys and so on, all got together, and suddenly the government thrust on that front dissipated in the face of such good leadership of the presentation of the importance of science. You need to provide solutions and not just whingers. You've got to come up with what government can do. They're busy people, they've only got short times to do stuff. If you help them with how to do it, you're helping with the problem. You've got to listen to the public and not just to the in-crowd. You've got to pick globally, that is under Boulding's law, if it exists, it's possible. So if somewhere else is doing it, then let's try and see how it works in Australia by adapting it to our circumstances. You've got to fix your own house. Physician, heal thyself, make sure you're doing things right. Research integrity, looking after the methodologies of what you do, transparency in your databases, access to your data, access to your results. If we do that well, we'll stand very differently from the competitors in consultancies and the like. You try and get hold of a consultant's report that justifies a client's actions in putting forward a case to government, and it is not easy. But universities should be easy in contrast. Pursue efficiency, do well, seek more long-term grants, more block grants, allow modular credentials in how you teach, fund by value adding, not just demand for your costs, and show that you can have your cake and eat it by being a worthy recipient of funds from the sources for funding without them affecting, biasing and altering the outcomes that you produce. If you do that, then you will have delivered on the promise of social sciences, as this volume says it can do and we can do. So to return to that volume and finish up quickly, I'm clearly running over time, let me say that this is just a sampling of policy impacts. Much more will follow from the Academy over time. And any slighted fellows in the room, please note, your day in the sun will come, and your very fellowship shows how much we love you. The present cases arose mostly from work or influence in the last couple of decades. Earlier work from distinguished social scientists, the Trevor Swans, Nugget Coombs, Finn Crisps and so on, is neglected here, as are the emerging works of younger scholars. We only tap the fellows of the Academy for much of this work, and we want to then move to those other older contributions and the newer contributions as well, as broadening the existing contributions we can know about. The focus is predominantly upon government policy. We can add more on business and community contributions, and we can also provide for those of you who need it, for this and for our future work on this, easy access on our website. So you can download an electronic copy of the volume now that it's being launched today. I've got to give a huge thanks to the team at the Academy who managed this process, John Beaton, Liz West, Murray Radcliffe, Sunita Kumar, and our writer Paula Hannes. Huge and daunting task, but they delivered on it so well. So thank you, guys and gals, for all of that. Folks, thank you. And with that, let us take the volume as well and truly launched. And now we can turn to our excellent panel to give some wider perspectives on this work from their own viewpoints. We've got them alphabetically here. We've got Linda Botterill, Bruce Chapman, Sue Richardson, and I've got their formal titles here somewhere. I did have. I've probably still got it here somewhere, what the positions were, but now I'm forgetting where it is. I've got so many bits of paper from so many... here it is, from so many sources. We've got Linda, who's the head of School of Government and Policy at the University of Canberra. We've got Sue, who's an emeritus professor of economics and an honorary professorial fellow at Flinders. And we've got Bruce, who is the Sir Roland Wilson Professor of Public Policy at the ANU. They're all names well known to you, I'm sure, and have worked in and out of the world of policy as well as within the academic ivory towers, and in a beautiful position to also comment on the contribution of the social sciences to shaping the nation. So I'd like to ask each of them in turn to spend maybe 5 or 10 minutes as they wish to comment on the issues raised in the volume from their own experience or reflection, and I'll just take them in serial sort of alphabetical order, and then maybe ask a few questions and open it up for discussion from anyone here who'd like to pursue the issues and ask other questions and queries. So I'll start with Linda, please.
Is this working? It is, excellent.
Oh, I didn't even need that all the
Okay,
time.
no, you probably didn't.
Yeah, I'm older, I don't know.
Thank you, Glenn, and thank you for inviting me to come along and comment on this. I enjoyed reading the report, and the breadth of research covered in there is really quite impressive. But it made me reflect that on social science in terms of its contributions to both policy but also to the community more broadly, in terms of the fact that we actually, as social scientists, make contributions at a whole range of different levels. And what I'd like to do is suggest that I've got a sort of a rough typology of different ways we can think about the contributions that social scientists make. And I'd like to suggest that this is with apologies to the work of Roger Pielke, who developed the typology in his rather lovely book called The Honest Broker. And he examined the role of science in the policy process. Now, he implied that he was including social science, but I think that the categories he used were actually more relevant to the natural sciences. So with a colleague, I've sort of adapted these a little bit. And the 4 categories that I'm thinking about, the first one is the social scientist as Enlightenment Researcher. And I think this is where we make our big contribution to the community generally. This is where we're considering the big questions of the functioning of society, the decision-making environment, the way our democracy operates. So an Enlightenment Researcher is somebody who is perhaps more like the philosophers that Glenn encountered in the corridors of the Coombs building, that they're providing new theoretical concepts and perspectives for understanding society and the communities that we live in, rather than relevant data for a particular express purpose. And as Carol Weiss described it, the imagery here is of social science generalisations and orientations percolating through informed publics and coming to shape the way in which people think about social issues. So this is where the big stuff comes from. This is where social science, we can't necessarily point to who came up with the idea, with the exception of some seminal texts, things like The Female Eunuch and Rachel Carson's book The Silent Spring, where ideas started to percolate through. But social science has a clear role in producing research that's thinking about these big picture issues for the community and for our society. Not necessarily recognised in ARC assessment impact exercises or because you can't identify who the specific researchers are necessarily who began an idea or a way of thinking. The second group that we think about is the academic activist, and these are researchers who undertake research with very particular values-based agendas in mind. Now, most of us do that without being conscious. We choose to research a particular area because we think it matters. So this applies to natural scientists as well, as people who research river red gums do so because they believe river red gums matter and are important. The same thing goes for my own research in the area of rural policy. I think that our policy towards our farming community and rural communities actually matters. That's why I pursue it. So to some extent, we're all academic activists in that our choice of area of research is driven by what we value and what we consider to be important. But academic activists are often even more precise about what they're trying to do, and feminist scholarship falls quite clearly into this category because it's not only trying to understand and explain society, but also to actually use that research to affect change, to be active in getting that change. The third category is perhaps the idealised researcher of evidence-based policy making, and this we've described as the knowledge broker. So these are researchers who provide research and evidence in response to very specific questions being generated by the policy process, often just drawing on existing research and repackaging it or systematising it or summarising it for the policy process. It's a somewhat linear and positivist view of the relationship between research and policy because it does fall in the trap of being seen somehow as being neutral and value-free as a source of sort of scientific truth. And these type of researchers are more likely to be found in the consultancies that Glenn mentioned than perhaps within the halls of academia. They're perhaps too the rarest of the social scientists because with the exception of perhaps the simplest statistical questions which you could direct at an economist, it's difficult to understand or conceive of a social science research question that's amenable to the construction of an uncontested consensus argument or answer. Because, as Glenn has already suggested, social science is hard. Keith Dowding went one step further and said, social science is not rocket science, it's harder. And I think I have some sympathy for that because when we're dealing as social scientists, our subject matter is reflective and self-aware. It responds to what we tell them about their behaviour. If a natural scientist observes a mob of kangaroos veering to the left when it hops, the fact that that observation has been made won't change the fact that that mob of kangaroos will continue to behave that way. But with social science research, we are part of the communities that we're in and we're feeding our information into the discussion and debate and we're influencing the behaviour that we're observing as we observe it. So we don't have a cumulative body of knowledge like the natural sciences, parts of which become uncontested. So the knowledge broker is I think, a slightly idealised type, particularly when it comes to social science. The final player, perhaps, is the one that is more reflected by the panel here, is the boundary player, which is the policy-engaged social scientist who is very well connected, possibly because they've had personal career histories that have provided them a period as policy practitioners before or when they've been involved in academia. And so they actually contribute to the formulation of the problem as well as its solution. They're not just taking the solution, the problem as given and providing an answer. Bruce, of course, is an obvious example of a boundary player, and I see Meredith here as well as another, and there's many of us in this room who have had that kind of career that's allowed us to very much have a foot in each camp. And it seems to me, as Pilkey argues of his typology, that society needs all four types of researchers. We need people to be thinking abstractly about our society and its improvement and its functioning. We need people who can be activists promoting areas where there's clearly social reform or political reform needed. We need people who can answer the questions directed to them when they're asked by the policy process. And we need the boundary players who are able to move comfortably between the two worlds of academia and public policy. One of the things I think that social science can really contribute is that I think we run the risk of being seen as a small cousin to the natural sciences, particularly when so many of the big policy challenges we're facing today appear to be about the natural sciences. They are issues like climate change, water management in the Murray-Darling Basin. But constantly asking for more and better evidence isn't necessarily the answer, and this has been alluded to previously. Because social science tells us that actually simply gathering more evidence might not actually be the best way to resolve policy controversies. We need to consider how people are going to respond to evidence and the way in which they use it. So, climate change isn't going to be solved by more climate science. It's going to be solved by sociologists and political psychologists and public policy specialists working out how we as people are going to negotiate our response to the challenges that the natural sciences have pointed to. So we actually need to be at the cutting edge of solutions to many of these problems, which may on the face of it appear to be problems from the natural sciences, but their solutions are going to come from people and from social sciences. And one area where I'm particularly interested at the moment is around the polarisation of public policy debate and the fact that we seem to be getting extreme black and white positions on so many policy issues. One area that I've been looking at has been around wind farms, and a recent Senate inquiry made the point. They actually had a box with a heading calling for the need for civility to be returned to public policy debate. And I think this is actually a very real problem. And if we look at the work of discursive psychologists, for example, they point out that there are a number of areas where in public policy we forget our manners. And that might sound very old-fashioned, but there are ways that we conduct conversations and debate and argumentation on a personal level where we respect particular social norms. We seem to have forgotten when we get to the level of public policy debate and we start seeing much more extreme positions coming out in public policy debate. And perhaps we should be looking to the work of discursive psychology and social psychology and other areas of the social sciences who can tell us how to improve the way we actually go about debating these very difficult and contentious issues. And I think with the wind farm example, we've recently seen, as a result of the Senate inquiry, more money thrown into doing research into whether there are actually health impacts from social science, from wind farms. The problem with that is that the people who believe they're getting ill from wind farms are not going to be convinced by just the production of more research. What needs to be done is better ways of engaging with these groups and the basis of their opposition, rather than vilifying them publicly. And this again goes back to remembering our manners. So finally, I'd just like to point out that social science, I think we have a bit of a challenge in selling what we do to the community, because what we do, first of all, is very patient. It can take a very long time for ideas to actually permeate and percolate through society and get into the policy consciousness and into social debate. So it's not always immediately obvious where these ideas have come from. As this report shows, social science is pervasive. It seeps into every corner of decision-making and public policy debate, and it can contribute by improving and informing the quality of that debate. And those of us who are involved, and Bruce and I have had this experience over the last 15 years with work we've been doing, social science needs to be persistent, because if we've got any chance of making a difference, sometimes we just have to keep hammering away at it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda, for that. And I'll turn over to someone I think not so much as a boundary player, but as centre-half forward, really, to Bruce Chapman, please.
Thanks, Glenn. I want to acknowledge the importance of this report from the Academy. I mean, social science has been a little bit on the quiet side in kind of promoting its benefits, and as everybody has already said, it's just so important, and it's kind of, a lot of it is invisible. Some of the great beneficiaries of wonderful economic policy have no idea that they have had that benefit. I'll just give you The most obvious recent example was the extraordinary reaction from the Australian Treasury and the Australian Government in 2009 with the response to the global financial crisis. I've been doing some modelling about the potential effects of increases in unemployment on long-term unemployment, that is, the number of people who'd be out of work for 1 year or more. And on the basic projections, when that recession potentially did loom, and for many countries was extremely severe and important, I was projecting from models that I was fairly confident in that the number of people who would be long-term unemployed would go up from about 60,000 to about 250,000. That was avoided. It was avoided because of extraordinary astute fiscal and monetary policy. And yet, let's just imagine I was right about this. There's 190,000 people who would have been out of work for over a year who are not. So it is invisible and it is important, and this report raises the visibility. And I think it's a great contribution. I don't want to talk broadly about the social sciences, but I wanted to share with you an observation or two about how academics can be involved in a productive way. And I want to talk specifically about my experience with the HEX system and with politics. I was a very naive, a very young and naive person when all this happened. Now I'm just an old and naive person, basically. But the politics of this, it kind of shocked me. And what shocked me was my innocence. I just didn't get it. I didn't know how things worked. So I want to share with you some of the political issues to do with that system. The first point to make about HEX is two things. It's a tuition charge. That's not unusual. I mean, just about every country in the world charges people to go to higher education. But it's also about the nature of the collection of the charge. And it's an income contingent charge, so that people don't have to pay anything up front, and they only pay when and if they currently earn about $56,000 a year. Most student loan systems in the world are not like that, although they've increasingly become more towards income contingent loans such as ours. Most student loan systems in the world are time-based. So in the United States, for example, the most common form of a student loan is called a Stafford loan, where people have 10 years to pay back a debt. The debt could be as high as, in the case of young lawyers, $150,000. Young lawyers, if they miss the payment, then they'll go into default. That's a terrible outcome for two agents. Number one, the defaulter, because their credit reputation is damaged, potentially permanently. And number two, for taxpayers who then pick up the tab. But our system is not like that. There is no default, there's non-payment, but you're not bankrupted out of the system. You're still there, so that if you earn above that level down the track, the government can get the money and credit reputations are intact. Now, the four aspects of the politics that I want to share with you are the parliamentary politics. Let me just point out from the beginning, that was close to irrelevant, because the coalition at the time, we're talking about 1988, 1989, were prepared to go along with it. John Howard said, I think inaccurately would be a euphemism, that they always supported all the reforms going through in the 80s, and that's certainly true with the floating of the dollar and the diminution of the tariff walls, but it was not true with HEX. They opposed it in the Senate. But that didn't matter to the parliamentary Labor Party, to the government, to the cabinet. They ignored the parliament. They ignored the students. There are a lot of protests. There are a lot of unfortunate, not necessarily highly comforting incidences. I can remember seeing hundreds of students going past my office to a demonstration in protest about HEX, carrying effigies of particular people. One of them had the word Chapman around it, and I must say, I thought it was incredibly gratuitously ugly. But this did not matter to the cabinet. The students did not matter, and the parliament did not matter. But two other aspects of the politics really did matter. Number one was the bureaucracy. And the bureaucracy did its best. The Australian Tax Office, love them as I do, I did not at the time, did their best to stop HEX for all kinds of reasons, mainly because of conservatism. This hadn't been tried anywhere, and it involved the Tax Office making a collection out of salary that they believed, or at least alleged, was impossible. It could not work. I thought at the time that this would be fairly straightforward, but it turned out to be very, very difficult. Because when I talked to the Tax Office, I was kind of the Pollyanna when it was suggested from the Rand Committee that somebody should go and talk to the tax office, I said, I'll go and talk to the tax office. This will be really fun because they'll just love what we're doing here. So I gave this little spiel to these three kind of grey men, and the spiel was, this is a great chance for regressive reform. All the money would be used to increase the number of places and in universities, there's a lot of people who can't get in now. It will help the poor because there's no charge up front, and isn't it fantastic? What do you think? And they looked at me with horror, and the guy said, no. He said, you don't know very much about economics, do you, Sonny? He didn't say Sonny, but he meant Sonny. And I thought, well, I kind of thought I knew something about economics, but he said, he decided to give me a lesson, and the lesson went like this. We're the tax office. We do not collect debt, we collect taxes. Off you go. So I was persistent, and I kept on going back, and it was kind of horrible because every time I went back, they come back to this principle. The principle is we do not collect debt. Well, I had a principle too. People shouldn't have to pay money up front to go to university. People, when they're going to university, should pay only when and if they are able to. The trouble with two principles when they collide is it's not resolvable because that's the nature of the principle. But they brought up so many objections. People die, they said. And I said, I don't think this is going to make more people die, do you? People go overseas, they said. I said, would you go overseas to save $10 a week? Because that's what it was. It wasn't exactly a very logical response, but I had to get kind of down and dirty with them. And then at one point, one of the guys said to me, he was the senior one because his chair was a bit high, I could tell. He said, what about women? Have you ever thought about women? He said. And I thought, well, that's pretty personal, really. What am I supposed to say about? I said, what do you mean have you ever thought about women? He said, let me tell you something about women. I thought, oh, well, I better take notes here. Right? Women marry brain surgeons and they live on the North Shore of Sydney, and they do sociology degrees at Macquarie University. That was the model. And I thought, and then when then they have a few children, and then when their children leave, they might do a bit more sociology. They never pay anything. It's completely unfair. And that's why you shouldn't have this system, because women won't pay, because you've got to make them pay up front. This was actually said to me by people in the Labor cabinet, and I won't mention their names, but one has the same initials as Senator Peter Walsh. So it wasn't all that clear that this was going ahead through the cabinet at the time. The only answer to this is the data. The data were completely clear. This is not going to happen, because most of the HEC step will be paid well before anyone took any time out to rear children. Now, at one stage when I'd almost given up, one of them said to me by way of casual conversation, so who's on this Rand committee? I wasn't on the Rand committee, I was an advisor to it, and I said Bob Gregory, and they thought that that was right because he was sensible and he would know that economics says you can't possibly do this, and Michael Gallagher, and then I said Meredith Edwards, and he kind of looked all grey and upset. Well, he kind of looked all grey at the beginning and upset anyway, but he turned to his mate and he said, we're stuffed. And I thought, that's interesting data. And one of the important things about all this is personal connections. I was a mate of Meredith's. I called her up. She was on the Rand committee. I said, why is the tax office so frightened by you, Meredith? You seem fairly benign to me. She said, what's the context? And I told them the context. They've got a principle. We do not collect debt. We collect taxes. And she said, but they do collect debt. Because in 1987, the Australian government instituted the child support system. The child support system is the first income contingent loan anywhere run by government. It wasn't HECS. So if you're if you're a non-custodial parent, you have to pay, depending on your income, for the upkeep of your child. This is debt collection. And they knew I'd find out, and I found out. And that was the end of the war. I also thought it helped that the Treasurer, Paul Keating, went and saw Trevor Boucher and said, you just do what John Dawkins wants, that's it. And he can be pretty scary, I can assure you. The other part of the politics of this, it just was so important, I didn't get it at all at the time, was within the Parliamentary Labor Party. And that was where the main opposition to HECS came from. It was from the old school left. And where did this come from? It was from a value notion, universities should be free. There is no such thing as free, but it was in the platform which said all education should be free. And there was such huge affection for Gough Whitlam and the fee abolition of 1974 that was going to be a big, big problem. Now, the weird thing is, when we looked into this quite seriously, I mean, I did my best. I was a great fan of Gough Whitlam's. It really had no effect. And the reason was that 75 to 85% of people had scholarships, teachers, college or Commonwealth, where they didn't pay fees anyway. We had this extraordinary meeting in John Dawkins' office where someone was explaining this point to John Dawkins, and she said, yes, Minister, nobody paid fees anyway. Only the rich, dumb ones paid fees, so who couldn't get a scholarship. And I thought, that's risky, saying they're rich and dumb. And it was risky. John Dawkins, there was a silence in the room, and he's kind of looked down at his notepad for a bit, and he said, well, I paid fees. The Secretary of his department, Vince Fitzgerald, instantly said, I paid fees too, Minister. But nobody believed him. I thought, she's so unlucky she's picked out the only two people in the country who paid fees, and she's called them rich and dumb. And this comes back to why HECS happened in the way it did. I mean, I was so interested in the economic properties of this insurance. It's an insurance instrument. It protects you from repayment hardship. It protects you from default. That's what was kind of motivating me, and I think the RAND Committee. But what motivated John Dawkins and that cabinet was really the need for a little pussycat. And this was a little pussycat. It was so benign. You didn't pay more than 1% of your income at a current dollar amount of $77,000, and its gentleness was what encouraged Dawkins to go with it, not the economics of it. The economics is always, in my view, overridden by the politics. So I wanted to share those observations with you. I learned a huge amount, but when people say to me, how does policy happen? It happens, you can't generalise very simply. The interpersonal relations in this instance turned out to be completely important. The data is so important. Understand the data. We could argue with the tax office in one sentence about female graduates repaying just by looking at female graduate participation rates. That was the end of the story. And also, most critically, get the politics. And if it's not working, it's not necessarily and hardly ever because of the evidence or the argument. Linda and I think, really understand drought policy, and most drought policy kind of deeply sucks. And no one will agree with us or even read the stuff. Why? Because the politics doesn't work, and it's a big lesson. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. And now over to Sue. I should say, Sue and I have known each other since we were foundation tutors in the School of Economics at La Trobe University some years ago.
Some few years ago.
And I've had the utmost respect for all Sue's work since then, so she's a wonderful person to also reflect on some of these issues that are raised by the volume we're launching today. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you, Glenn, but I did get the short straw speaking after Bruce because I've had this experience before and I know it doesn't work. But I'm not going to try and do what Bruce does because I couldn't possibly. But I was for a few years, had the extraordinary privilege of being President of the Academy of the Social Sciences. And I say it was a privilege because the Academy is full of these really bright people, nearly all of whom are really nice. And they have this generosity and desire to really make the world a better place through their scholarship and their insights and their energy and their efforts. They're not principally ivory tower people, and they want to share what they know and see it put to good purposes. And that's across the whole of the social sciences, which is a very broad area of intellectual inquiry. So Glenn mentioned some of the areas, but let me just rehearse again what we mean by the social sciences. You know, it includes psychology, it includes law, it includes education, demography, politics, governance, finance, accounting, business, economics, demography, if I didn't say demography. So it's a very wide political science. It covers a very broad scope, and the thing that distinguishes, in my mind, the social sciences from the other really important scholarly disciplines, the natural sciences, in some sense, and the humanities, is both its subject matter, which is how do human societies work and how can you make them work better, hence the social. And the other really important one is its methods. So the social sciences, and they're called sciences for a reason, come from a theoretical base. Each of the social sciences has frameworks for understanding how the world works, which enables you to assemble large amounts of information and make sense of it, have it of course there's always the problem, you've got so much information that unless you have a framework you can't get any order out of that mass. So the having theoretical structures that enable you to make sense of the messy picture that you're looking at, but also to know what are the right questions, because that's always the hardest thing, what's the right question, is a very important component of all the social sciences. But the second really important component is the attention and care paid to evidence. So these are not just hypothetical speculations. Philosophy is a wonderful thing, but it doesn't actually care much about evidence. The social sciences do. And that attention to evidence means that you do have an objective, an external way of deciding which of the hypotheses actually stand up to scrutiny and can be shown to either deliver the goods or not deliver the goods, and that's a really important way of making progress. So those qualities of having an intellectual theoretical structure and the capacity to deal with bring significant data to bear on the propositions means that the social sciences can be really valuable in both the design of solutions to policy problems and the evaluation of the implementation of those policies or any natural experiment if you can't find an unnatural one. So evaluation is crucially important if you're going to get progress. And so I think that those qualities of the social sciences which make them rather different from the others make them fortuitously particularly important for public policy development. And if I think of what are this is not peculiar to me, but if you ask what are the main areas of challenge for this nation and for many nations like us, they go to the obvious things like having a really well-functioning education system, a well-functioning and efficient health system, good housing, good social welfare support and pensions to catch the people who fall through the opportunities that the market might offer. They go to macroeconomic management and the setting up of structures so that we encourage efficient and competitive behaviour in the production of our goods and services. They go to foreign policy, trade policy, the whole area of crime and justice and the rule of law. These are foundational dimensions of the areas that our society wishes to get right in order to create the opportunity for good lives for all of its citizens. And I might finish my list by mentioning one of our current, absolutely disgraceful disasters, which is energy policy and climate policy, where the solutions are there. Everybody knows what the solutions are, but we have this toxic political debate. So the political scientists need to lift their game and explain to us why we have this toxic political debate and what the solution might be. I should mention also, particularly because Hal Kendig's in the room, the policies with respect to demography and ageing, and how as a society, which no society in history ever before has confronted the demographic profile that we are currently in and heading towards. So how does a society humanely, effectively adapt to providing good lives for not only those of the younger ages, but also those of older ages? So if you think about all of those topics, they're quintessentially social science topics. In many cases, you'll benefit a great deal from drawing in the other disciplines from the humanities because of the essentially human nature of these things, but also the natural sciences. So if you're looking at climate change or water management or even housing, then technological solutions and ageing. Technological solutions can be very helpful, but they mostly don't stand alone. Technological solutions are there waiting to be embedded in a framework of policy and action. They don't, in themselves, get you to where you want to be. It's the social sciences that do that. So the understanding and the advancement of that we're capable of through the social sciences, I think, is crucial to enabling us to have the sort of quality of life and the fairness of our society that is within reach. It's possible if we can have the good fortune that some of the key ideas that the social sciences come up with can actually be converted into policy of some sort. Now, as Bruce's wonderful story and makes vividly clear, there's a lot of luck in this. The ducks have to all line up in a row, and you've got to have Meredith Edwards there at the crucial moment, in the right spot. Otherwise, the whole thing doesn't work. So that fragility of translating the great ideas into reality is, I think, the margin that we should probably all think rather harder about. Can we do better at making this a more robust process than just relying on, wow, we managed to get that through, but all the ones that you didn't, which were also extraordinarily important. There is a very similar story about the introduction of Medibank. It was introduced into the Parliament when there was a double dissolution, and I think there were 3 pieces of legislation to be voted on, and at the last minute they only voted on one, and they just happened to choose Medibank. It could easily have been on the other side of the ledger. So these stories of, it's almost a fluke as to which ones get through and which ones don't. And we ought to be able to do much better than that. So I do want to talk a bit about fairness and inclusion as well, because it's not an inherent characteristic of the social sciences, but my observation is that it's very often to be found in the work of social scientists, that they do care a lot about notions of fairness and justice. And that, I think, fits very well with the Australian ethos, that we're not just about winners and caring for the winners and setting up structures that will promote those who are most capable of taking advantage of the opportunities. We care also about the ones who, for various reasons, get left behind. So we have some wonderful institutions which have a social science background or component to them, which are about promoting fairness. And I'll just mention one that I'm actually a member of, and it's called, surprisingly, the Fair Work Commission. Very nice. It used to, of course, be the Australian Court of Arbitration and Conciliation back in 1904 when it was created. So, look, this is, Australia is in some ways pioneers these fabulous components of the art of government, and the Fair Work Commission, as it's now called, is one of those. We are unique in having an industrial relations tribunal that's been concerned with fairness and adjudicating the balance of power between the worker and the employer, which of course is never a fair balance, since 1904. And it's still going. And one of the things it does, of course, there's a lot of work done on unfair dismissal and bullying and other protections for workers who get mangled in the workplace. But we also have this unique process for setting minimum wages, which where we say it's not fair to pay less than this amount for an hour of an adult person's time. And we are actually unique in the way we do that, not only because there's a national minimum wage, but we set minimum rates for skills that go up the ladder, right up to, I think, airline pilots have the highest award rate. That's peculiar to Australia, but we also have a process, which again is unique, whereby the Fair Work Commission and the panel that I'm on that sets national minimum wages gets advised by the government, but it makes the decision, which is then implemented. So it carries executive power, whereas other countries that have minimum wages, they have an expert group that advises the government, and then the government chooses whether or not to implement it. Or if you're America, it's complete chaos. So that notion of fairness as being embedded in our institutions, again, is quintessentially social science. Everybody who's a member of the Fair Work Commission is a social scientist. They're lawyers, they're industrial relations, they're human resources, they're economists. And they reflect on this extraordinarily important part of people's lives, the protection of your rights not to be bullied, to be unfairly dismissed or underpaid in the workplace. We have, of course, the NDIS, which is another creation, if you like, of the social sciences, and the very powerful voices that spoke up for saying we have to care for the most vulnerable people in our society. And the design of that is a social sciences project, and the evaluation of that, which was built in right from the very beginning, and indeed my group at Flinders University is actually doing that evaluation, which is built in from the beginning to say, let's learn all the lessons that we can while we introduce this to the first 40,000 people across Australia, learn what works and what doesn't, and what the traps are, get that as right as possible before we spread it out more widely to the 450 or 500,000 people that we expect to come under the umbrella of the NDIS. Now that's lovely social sciences. First of all, come up with a design, then to actually trial it, as it were, and evaluate it, and then take those lessons into the design of the final. So and there are other examples around child wellbeing. I mean, we know, again from the work of the social sciences, how extraordinarily important the early years of childhood are to people's future life chances, and the work of Fiona Stanley and her many colleagues in the area of getting a decent chance for every child to get that start in life that gives them a chance of being independent and well-functioning adults is just extraordinarily important. So I've read this. It's fantastic. I've been thinking about these things for years, and I didn't know half the stuff. Or at least I knew it, but I'd never seen it. I'd never thought of it. Bringing it all together and saying, wow, that's an amazing contribution that the social sciences have had to a lot of the really unusual things that Australia does in the public policy area. The examples of plain packaging, or HECS, the management of the Murray-Darling water system through water trading, which, we're world leaders in all sorts of areas that you wouldn't have thought of. And what this has done is to bring it all together. Not all of it, there's a lot more out there that's not in here. Bring it all together, and you can see just how powerful the social sciences are, and probably just about everybody in this room is a social scientist. So go forth and be powerful.
Thank you, Sue. Peter, given time, can you give us some guidance? Should we ask for questions from the floor? We've got time for a little of that.
Hi, I'm a PhD candidate at AU, and I want to ask, what is left of the humanities if philosophy, law, history and anthropology are classified as social sciences in Australia now?
Do you want to go?
Yes, it's a boundary war, but in fact, for instance, each of the academies, interestingly enough, through no special quota reason or policy, have about 500 to 600 members, fellows. Ancient word that some object to still, or should, but we haven't found a better one. But I digress, that if we've got about 500 people who identify with each, in some cases you've got double memberships, people overlapping across. But essentially, you've got a boundary dispute on the other end of the humanities into, say, the arts, meaning performing arts and visual arts and the like. So particularly, though, it's languages, those areas that, in a sense, don't depend crucially upon the gathering of quantitative evidence about the operation of peoples in society. So it's often the creative components of the mind. So lots of philosophers for instance, choose to be inside the Academy of Humanities rather than social sciences, depending on how engaged they are in social rather than what you might call ethical and ethereal analysis. Others are languages, areas like arts appreciation, culture, standards of excellence, what it constitutes, and so on. And language, you think about it, are abstract constructions that don't depend upon empirical groundings as to how you define language, and that includes English literature and those sorts of fields of study. History quite often sees itself as much more humanities than social science, and non-empirical historians who are really narrative storytellers see themselves as much more in the humanities. But it is a boundary dispute, just like there is between the natural and physical sciences, and indeed across from the various stems to HAS. There are significant boundary differences there. Where do psychologists locate, for instance? So it's not for us in the social sciences to, in a sense, accord a field to humanities. We look at people who apply to become part of us, and it's mainly the disciplines identified in universities that Sue mentioned earlier. But it's a blurred boundary, and that's relevant for one other bigger and important policy thing, which is those boundary blurs, those boundary disputes, are becoming less as disputes, more important as productive sources of insight. And so, for instance, the 4 learned academies, along with a newly formed academy in health and medical science, are working very productively together through the Australian Council of Learned Academies to look at interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary projects. And this is a theme, we think intrinsically it's wonderful. We're trying to develop disciplines of interdisciplinarity, if you like, as to how do you judge stuff that comes from different areas. You know in your own area how to judge excellence in its theory and data and so on. When you pull these things together, how do you know it's been done well and is excellent in turn? And we're trying to begin to define that as a way forward, because we regard this as really intellectually challenging and interesting. But the other is, we've heard speech after speech, and I think Linda reminded me, even Martin Parkinson, a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, has been saying this of late. But Peter Shergold said it, Mike Keating said it, Ian Watt said it. There's a sort of a tradition of secretaries of Prime Minister and Cabinet, as they go towards retirement, to say about how they need more holistic, is the word that is used, holistic advice from the academic community, and that's one reason they haven't listened to much of the academic work, because academics won't pull their insights together, whereas what you deal with in government decision making are holistic problems that need the insights from all of these areas. Our view in the academies was, well, that's what you're paid for in the public service, to pull this stuff together, not to create it, but to synthesise it. But it's clear that the public service and the governments quite often don't necessarily take that view and want more of that interdisciplinarity. And we're very happy in these days, I would say. Anna Maria Arabia from the Academy of Sciences is here, for instance, and we work very closely with her academy, with the Academy of Humanities and Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering, to try and come up with a solution to these boundary problems, so that you don't have to ask your question, in a sense.
Hi, Stephen Taylor. I'm a professor at the Business School, but I'm here as the Australian Business Leaders Council research scholar. A lot of the work I've been doing for the Australian Business Leaders Council over the last 18 months has addressed in different ways the challenges we face in demonstrating more than just the quality of research. And we know that next year the ERA will in some ways maybe look more like the aborted RQF from back in 2007, and will be asked to demonstrate not just the quality, we might interchange that with rigour, of what we do, but also the relevance of what we do. And so I was particularly interested in the Academy's report because in some ways it addresses that question of relevance. And I don't think we have a very good idea of exactly how we'll demonstrate relevance. I'm sure it'll be shaped by the rules that the government and the ARC finally come up with. But we really, if you look at what happens in the UK, there's a reliance on sort of case studies, and in some ways these discussions are sort of like quasi-case studies. So, one challenge I wanted to throw to the panel is, in the business school community, every university has a business school in Australia, basically. Not every university has a medical school, for example. The result is that there are some very good business schools in Australia in terms of research quality, and there are a number that realistically are not very good at all. And some of those perhaps see the idea of relevance as an opportunity to demonstrate their significance independent from the way in which they have not been ranked very highly on research quality. And then there obviously are those of us who have a view that it's difficult to imagine how research can be relevant without actually being high quality research to begin with. So that was a challenge I wanted to throw to the panel. If I can just very quickly mention one separate insight from my own discipline. I think there are a lot of cultural problems in Australia for many disciplines in dealing with policymakers, and I'll use as an example, in terms of the regulation of financial markets, and in particular organisations like ASIC, which tend to come at things from a legal perspective, in contrast to, say, the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US or the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, which tend to have much more of what I term an economics-based way of approaching regulatory issues, and which typically work much more closely with the research community to address issues. My favourite example was towards the end of the global financial crisis, the then chair of ASIC, Tony D'Aloisio, was asked why Australia was the last major capital market that still had a ban on short selling. Because, of course, regulators love to believe that if you just stop people from short selling, that somehow prices won't fall. And Tony D'Aloisio's answer was, we have research which supports that. Now, the SEC supported financially a lot of research, some of which went on to be published in the Journal of Financial Economics and the Journal of Finance, that shows very, very clearly that banning short selling is not an answer. So we asked him, we said, well, can we see your research so that we can have an informed debate? To which the answer was no. So my second issue the panel might like to meditate or comment on is, how do you address those cultural problems? Because I think that's what that was an example of. It's a cultural problem.
Yeah. Peter, I think Linda was happy to respond there.
Just a few comments. I admit to the fact that my School of Government and Policy is in the Faculty of Business, Government and Law, so we have but I think one of the points, and it's not a direct answer to your question, I'll leave that to other panel members, but one of the comments that it does raise for me around this issue of impact is that the problem is going to be for individual researchers in demonstrating their impact, because public servants, policymakers don't have a culture of attribution. They don't necessarily cite particular academics. They'll get ideas percolate up, as we've described, through discussions with interest groups who may have read reports that have been produced by academics. But when they're then talking about it, they're not talking about it in terms of Professor Jones wrote this report. So I think one of the hardest part for the social sciences, particularly when we're talking about impact on policy, but I think to a large extent also impact on business, is going to be the fact that the very people that we are influencing don't have a culture of citing our work, of citation. So you can't necessarily be able to make those linkages, and unless you've got something directly that you were in on the conversation on Tuesday with an income contingent loan for drought, and on Wednesday the government introduced it and you can make a connection, it's much harder, I think, for us. And I think that's going to be one of the real challenges around the impact agenda, is making those connections.
My response on the culture question, which is extraordinarily important. Of course, academics have a culture which is not always aligned, which is mostly not aligned with the public service culture or the policy community culture as well, is that you've got to have long-term relationships before it is worth investing in trying to understand the other culture and to then modify your own strategies. So the one-night stand doesn't work, it's got to be a long marriage. And then you can get somewhere.
Could I say, though, that in a sense, if we got beyond the 20% success rate in grants and started making more of the good social sciences, as of course in other areas, funded, because they're all very worthy and can pay their way. That is, if you're wanting to deal with debt and deficit, you grow the country, and that then pays for the future welfare and education and all else. If you did more research, for instance, into culture, would be very feasible. It's the sort of project that really appeals. So, what explains, for instance, the participation of lawyers less in research than philosophers? And clearly, there are things like the external income earning capacity type issue, that lawyers can go out and earn a fortune on a Friday with Deloitte's or whatever the law firm's names are, and philosophers can't, by and large. So philosophers stay and philosophise, and lawyers go out and earn money as much on a Friday as they can get in 4 days of academic work. And that analysis, combined with a bunch of culture and internal motivations, because they don't go out 5 days a week, they still want to be there 4 days a week doing some teaching and work. That sort of research into that would then help begin to provide solutions. How do we then generate research from some areas compared to others? Or an analogous one that some delightful work is being done at ANU at the moment. People like Marion Saw and others are working on the diversity of female participation in the social sciences. And it varies dramatically from which discipline to what discipline you're talking about. And they are producing that sort of explanation. What explains the culture of which discipline and why it operates the way it does? So, one solution to me is let's research this more, and we can provide good guidance on how to make things better.
Can I just say something quickly on measuring impact? I think it's impossible, actually, quantitatively, to compare different contributions in social sciences. I mean, I'll give you an example. My colleague Adrian Pagan did modelling for central banks in Europe, England, New Zealand, Australia, and changed the whole way the data was used to explore and initiate and to make decisions about monetary policy. That is so important and kind of unheard of. I mean, it doesn't get much publicity. It's changed the lives of hundreds of millions of people. But you compare that to something like Medicare. How can you do that? I can't imagine in quantitative terms how you start to do that. But one way I think about this, which is not very informed, but think about the last time you were on a jobs committee and there were 5 candidates, and then they were interviewed, or they gave a seminar, or they gave a talk, or whatever. You read the CV, you read the referees' reports. You can't come up with any one quantitative measure about the ranking of them, but the committee can kind of agree. And I think that that's the way to go, essentially. And the case studies example in the UK is kind of right. And to make it quantitative in a kind of hypothetical or artificial way, you could say there are 5 case studies of policy here. We can rank them, but that's not enough. But let's say we'll give you 100 points, and then you have to allocate the points on the basis of the arguments and a subjective and sometimes empirical judgment about their effect. And that will force you to come up with a ranking which has got a quantitative aspect to it.
How would social sciences be able to implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart effectively? I have many more questions, but I'm doing
I'd hate to be on Q&A because they say, well, so what do you think about X? And you never thought about it, right? You have no idea. And you say, oh, look, that's a great question. I'll be back next week, okay? I've got to talk to a few people.
I think that's a really good example, though, of the need for us to think about evidence really broadly. And I think one of the limitations that we've had in a lot of the evidence-based work has been that it's been about evidence coming from what we understand to be the scientific method, whether it's the social sciences or the natural sciences, and things like Indigenous forms of knowledge, subjective experience. And I mean, my work with the wind farms, for example, has been very much around trying to understand the perspective of people who are opposed to wind farms on the basis of purported health impacts of the turbines, when all of the science coming out of NH and MRC and broadly internationally says that there is no connection. well, sitting down at kitchen tables with people clearly in distress and suffering as a consequence of the wind farm, it really raised some interesting questions for me about how you bring these different types of, and I don't have an answer for you, but it's very much something I think that social science needs to be exploring more, is how we bring those different perspectives into our understanding. And just to give you a brief idea about, my comment about bringing back our manners, I've been working with a linguist, and we were doing some conversation analysis around the interviews that we conducted around the wind farms to actually dig down into the way people were expressing their opinions and how they navigated difficult social issues. And one of the social norms that is being breached at the public policy level, but is still navigated very carefully at the interpersonal level, is around your subjective right to illness and to experience your own illness. So if I were to say to you now, I've got a headache, in a normal discourse like this, you wouldn't question. You'd think, oh, well, she's done okay, she's still talking, she's got a headache. But you wouldn't question my subjective experience of that headache. But what happens when we get into public policy debate, we start, because we have science that says a wind farm doesn't cause a headache, we then start using language, and I'm quoting somebody who's actually a wind farm proponent who has actually called these people wingnuts, and then publicly defended the use of the term wingnut because they were ignoring the science. And when we interviewed people on the ground who were supporters of the wind farms, they were very careful in their language and the way they discussed the health impact on others, not to contest their subjective experience of poor health. So they worked their way around it, they navigated, and this is something we do instinctively when we communicate. We are actually working our way around these social norms. So I think those kind of insights from social science can help us think a little bit more clearly, well, how do we think about a debate around wind farms? No, funding another $3 million telling you there are no health impacts from wind turbines is not going to satisfy these people who are ill. We should be thinking about how we do that. And I think the same thing goes to a lot of these very complex issues where there's different forms of knowledge and different forms of evidence that are relevant to the policy question.
Peter, can I add two things to that? One is a short answer. I would want to get together with fellows of this academy such as Larissa Berendt and Marcia Langton and John Altman and others to produce some expertise on this problem to help us address it. The broader answer, and it's one that's been very frustrating, is when I was at Universities Australia, I tried to get Vice-Chancellors to support the notion of an Indigenous academy. And the motivation for it was not appointing only Indigenous scholars. It wasn't that. It was an academy devoted to Indigenous knowledge, which I understood to be holistic knowledge, integrated knowledge, to give it another phrase. And the example that's been particularly successful is in New Zealand with Maori learned academies and institutes of research. We've got some political problems, of course, as always, with existing groups like ATSIS and others who have their own sort of role in this. But we also had, at the time from University of Australia, the Vice-Chancellors were scared stiff that the 4 learned academies would oppose it because a 5th academy would oblige divvying up of the money. Now, once you recognise that, there is a solution, which is to go to government to get a bigger pie, that is, the dedicated, hypothecated funding for a further academy. Now, that doesn't apply so much to the Academy of Health and Medical Research, which has just commenced, because they have lots of money. But there was a very frustrating attempt to get University of Australia to back an Indigenous academy, and it fell down on some of the politics, but the bottom line in the end was we had to, in principle, get a breakthrough on the funding, and it's tiny funding. But that would have been a way of developing the breakthrough on better knowledge, integrated knowledge that drew on what we have as a particular advantage in this country to utilise better.
In drawing these activities to a close, I'm sure that the Academy would be delighted if any of you want to take a second copy of the report, as long as some are left out there, as long as you're confident that whoever you give it to will read it. I'd like to volunteer